Hello? Yes. Welcome to this third module in this talk about risk. And now we're going to talk more about certain aspects of risk management. And we have covered understanding of risk, definition of risk, the concept of risk, and aspects also of risk assessment. And now a little more about risk management. And the first issue I would like to address is this use of acceptance criteria, also linked to tolerability limits. And it's typically of this form that you define a certain probability number, a target, let's say probability 1 times 10 to minus 4. And if the risk assessment is coming up with a number below this, it is acceptable risk. If it's higher than this number, it is unacceptable risk. Now, what can we say about this way of thinking about risk, this kind of decision-making rule that is really based on risk assessment on probability numbers? I say this kind of approach should be used with care. Well, actually I'm saying, or I should have said maybe should not be used at all, because this procedure cannot be really justified. We talked about risk is more than probability numbers. In this case, we can have two situations, one where you have strong knowledge supporting the number, one with weak number, giving the same probability. But you don't care about that. If your criterion is simply given by the probability, you don't see the strength of knowledge supporting these numbers. So it becomes a number game, partly, easily a number game. Different assumptions would give different numbers. You should include also other aspects when making judgments about risk being acceptable or not, or having a certain minimum level. You still need to incorporate other aspects, and the knowledge aspects is certainly relevant. Okay, the next sort of principle is I'm going to discuss is this Allard principle. It's a principle that is really sort of supporting safety investments. Because, well, the definition is that risk shall be reduced to a level that is as low as reasonable, practicable, allowed. And it's based on the principle of gross disproportion. And that is really a strong, very strong principle in favor of safety. Because it's saying that if you have a measure that is improving safety, you shall, as a rule, implement that measure. That's the rule. Only in the cases where you are able to demonstrate that the costs are grossly disproportionate to the benefits gained, you are allowed not to do it, not to implement this measure. So the burden of proof is reversed. So this is really strong. So then it is really strange to see that to verify a LARP, people are using cost-benefit analysis. Maybe not so strange, but it is not an approach that can be justified. You're using cost-benefit analysis, ENPV, expected net present value calculations, for example, to demonstrate a LARP. Principle based on expected value. But we know safety and risk reduction should not be based on expected value. This poor description of risk. Basically ignoring aspects of risk and uncertainties. So, you have a principle, a LARP, that are in favor of safety. But then you adopt a principle that's not in favor of safety, reducing risk uncertainties to verify it. It doesn't make sense. There are ways of trying to deal with this kind of problem issues and this kind of procedures using expected value calculations, cost-benefit analysis, and then assessments of uncertainties in the next iteration, but I won't go further into that. It is described in various textbooks. Now, let me remind you about this important sort of balancing act. The risk assessment is really about balancing various concerns. This is an important figure in my view, because risk management is really about this, finding the balance between development on the one hand and protection on the other. Now, certain approaches in risk management are supporting one of these, like the development is supported by expected value calculations like ENPV, cost-benefit analysis. These are basically, at least to a large extent, ignoring uncertainties and risks. So they are sort of in favor of development. On the other hand, you have sort of principles for supporting protection. And that cautionary, precautionary principles and thinking are for that purpose. Also, risk acceptance criteria have this kind of purpose. And the alarm principle is also on that side. But if you adopt the other, if you adopt this kind of verification procedure using expected values to verify alarm, you are sort of moving the alarm to the other side, to the development side, which was not the intention, I should think. Okay, let me reflect a little about this interesting book by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, Thinking Fast and Slow. Have you read this book? I guess many of you have. It's a bestseller and it's very well written, of course. But when I was reading this book some time back, I was surprised or rather shocked when I read on page 323 what he's writing about risk. He said that in general that we have a lack of basic ability to treat small risk. We either ignore them or give them too much weight. We overestimate small risks. We give them too much weight. This is really his thesis, and he's using some examples, and this one is interesting from going back to 2001, 2004 in Israel. A lot of suicide bombings on buses, and there were 23 bombings and 236 fatalities. And then you can calculate with some certain number of bus riders a certain frequency of being killed by taking in the bus in this period, giving some historical frequency rate. Now, so what he is saying, Daniel Kahneman, is that for any traveler, these numbers are then quite low, he point to, and the risks were tiny, he is saying. The risks were tiny because his frequency, historical frequency, were tiny. Now, but he's saying more that I knew that the risk was just nothing. And he was embarrassed that because he was driving, and when he came close to a bus, he was driving fast to get away from the bus. This was not rational, he said, because the risk was so small. And by being affected, he gave a high decision weight to just a small probability. It was not rational. So, what do you say about this? It completely, it just based on some sort of historical data-based thinking about risk. It's not what we are recommending here. It's a completely different view on risk. This, in my view, doesn't make sense at all. First of all, of course, you don't have the future rate when you in 2002 are addressing risk sort of before you're going to make a decision about taking the bus or not. You have the rate up to that time. Maybe you're informed by that. That is certainly informative, but think about the next hour. What is risk for you the next hour and how to assess that risk? I mean, the data you have heard, the data you have about what have happened before is relevant, but the next hour, I mean, the pattern could be different, the intensity could be different in the next hour compared to what you have seen on the average in the last year. Uncertainties, what's going to happen the next hour is really the key. That is the key aspects of risk. It's not the historical data. That is what our perspective completely is different than the one being described by Daniel Kahneman here. In this example on page 323. I'm not talking about his general work or analysis, which is really impressive, but this particular case. This animal risk is difficult to conceptualize and assess and manage, but I strongly believe that you need to capture the uncertainty aspects of risk much more than you see in traditional perspective based on historical data and probability that we have seen in this example. We need to acknowledge that uncertainty is the key aspects really of risk as in the showing in this figure. These are some of the key points that I've been highlighting. Now, to assess and manage risk, we need to see beyond probabilities and expected values. There is something more. Risk is more than probabilities and expected values, and that has to be reflected in the way we are assessing risk and managing risk. Uncertainty is a key aspect of risk, and that makes things more complicated, but it's certainly relevant. In the Kahneman case, uncertainty, we saw the importance of highlighting uncertainties. We're not talking about that this is just sort of a reflecting perceptual issues, fear, etc. It could be a cold, rational thinking about uncertainties. Still, we think that facing these uncertainties in the case of with these buses, it is rational to be cautionary. Don't take the bus because the uncertainties are there. Getting more insights, more knowledge. It's rational. It's not only the historical data that should decide really what is a rational way of dealing with this risk. Being cautious, given the uncertainties, is often, in many cases, rational. On the other hand, of course, we cannot be too cautious because then we will do nothing. And life is about this balancing, this kind of trying to protect and at the same time to develop. And if you're focusing too much on one of these, you're in trouble. It applies to nearly any activity in life, personal as well in business. This balancing thing, not too much on one of these sides. You need to find the balance. There's not only one sort of right balance. It's really subjective. We have different political parties that have completely different views on finding this balance. The same with you and me. This balance, the way we are doing this is different. That we have to acknowledge. We cannot find a scientific rule showing the optimal balance. This is a key point. And this, of course, all this should be reflected in the way we are dealing with decision making when it comes to risk. black swan type of risk exists. We have seen that. And we need to confront this risk in a better way than we are doing today, in the way we're dealing with risk assessment and how we do risk management. That's a huge challenge. Thank you.